Hello, everyone. It's Rick Klumpenhouwer calling from my office. And this is not where I usually work. I usually work from home, but I wanted to do it in the office to get some peace and quiet. You will see for instance, on this side, my plant is still surviving after all this time, but it looks a little spindly. So I apologize for that. Otherwise, I can't do much about the video, the quality of the video, let's put it that way, and the quality of the talent behind it. But so I will just get on with it, and we can hopefully have a good discussion afterwards when we talk about it together, when we are actually together. I'm recording this just shortly before the actual presentation. So let me share my screen and go from there. And I'm conscious of the time as well, so I will make sure that we don't waste all the time hearing me yammer on and on about this. So let's get going. Okay. So hopefully you can all see that. This is a bit different than the title you have, which was shortened for various reasons, but really my focus here is on given the pandemic surge, and this was, of course, from August, but also now, and the surge in digital services. What does this mean for privacy governance in particular? But I'm going to get into all kinds of governance and how that can be applied at a certain point in this short time that I have here. But I want to start off with giving you an idea of what COVID-driven digital transformation looks like in terms of some statistics that I found and on what has happened since March 2020. What are the privacy challenges around that? Some pretty high level key highlights, and go over some of the regulatory challenges with that, what the regulatory environment is, of course, and then what are their regulatory challenges, and then get into how digital governance, privacy governance, and information governance, I'm lumping them all in shamelessly together. How can that work within an organization? Because in the end, it's organization by organization, user by user. That's how effective privacy governance happens, and information governance. And there's beginning to be a realization that there really isn't much of a difference between those two. So let's move on to some stats. So since COVID-19 has come into play, there has been an acceleration of what this is calling customer interactions. Now, this is very much private sector oriented, but I imagine in government, the same kinds of figures will be in play. So this shows a pretty extensive and very, very marked percentage increase in digital interactions right across the globe. North America, even more so. Now, pretty easy to see why that's happening, because people are working at home, they're working digitally, they're not having meetings. Therefore, the digital interactions need to come into play. So just one set of statistics to illustrate that. Here's another. The acceleration into digital, the use of digital collaboration and using digital services has been astounding, really, during the COVID-19 crisis. This is the comparison of the actual versus the expected, and how much that has increased over the actual expected. So there is a huge indication here that yes, digital transformation was happening, but it has been accelerated substantially since COVID-19. So we're talking about a real revolution in an acceleration and a speed up of the use of digital technology in our workflows and everything that we do in the workplace, really because of COVID-19. And the other idea is, well, is this just something, the other concept of the other question is, will this last beyond the recovery? And this gives you some answers from various organizations that yes, they do. The vast majority think this will stick. Once you've put yourself into the pot of digital transformation, you're going to stay there. And that's not surprising, especially with from information professionals who know that people like to stick with what they have. And certainly if they put the effort into setting up their digital transactions and their services, getting to learning them, getting to know them, and working around them to do their work in this new environment, they are more likely to stick with that. That may be proven wrong, but there is certainly an opinion that will be that way, and it certainly won't be back to what it was before. So what are the current to future trends in this digital transformation that was already happening before? I'll go over some of the privacy, key privacy concerns, and from the digital technology that has been in place for some time. One of the more obvious one is anything around surveillance, of course. There is now the concept of surveillance capitalism, which is using personal data for marketing, using personal data to convert into a revenue stream. This is monetized, in a way, monetizing personal information. Personal information has a value. The idea is, and this is part of the idea about marketing, is to direct and manipulate human behavior through data towards an end. And if this is to buy my products, or is it to do something else, or to change behavior, that is a concerning thing around privacy. And it is now very much a reality and built into certainly the internet and a lot of the systems out there. Some of the big thinkers around this, including the former CEO of BlackBerry, are very concerned. And some of these concerns are coming literally from the private sector. The idea of subversion of free will. If you are being manipulated, if you are being directed, and you don't even know how, that is an erosion of free will. So that is a general concern. Everything is as a service. Of course, we're talking about cloud services, and with this, there's a linking of personal information through a network rather than through a direct service. So you don't know where things are coming from. You don't know where things have been. You don't know how things may have been harvested. There are many hands on the till. So on the tiller of the ship of your organization and your information. So how do you control that if everything is dispersed as much as that? It is well beyond direct collection, which is the idea of regulating collection is a big concern of privacy. And what is collection? Where is the collection point? The reuse of information, all of that, when a collection is happening, how it's happening, and why is very obscured. It's very difficult to nail down, almost completely hidden from subjects. The other concern, of course, is that all this is a global activity. This is not, it is not confined to specific nation states and specific jurisdictions. However, the regulation around it is very much jurisdictional. So how do we deal with this global activity, these global trends, these global privacy issues with geographic regulation? And I'll get into that in a little bit. Specifically on the privacy challenges, some specific things are, with the remote workplace, a lot more incentive for employers to gain control. They're not with them, they're not with them physically. How can they supervise them? And that usually is equated with surveillance. And this means putting in software around keystrokes on what they're actually doing through their systems. And quite frankly, the remote workplace is a workplace based on information technology. And that's how it's created, that's how it's used, that's how it's transmitted for remote workers. So you can have surveillance tracking of those activities using your technology, your devices at home. So there's that concern. Is that good HR, and is that allowable under privacy, really? So we're talking about productivity monitoring, keystrokes, online transactions, image capture, use of their equipment. All of these things are being done. Online training education, of course, we're talking about students having to work online, having to work remotely, having to do tests remotely as well. So we're talking about e-proctoring software, which monitors what you're doing during a test, of course, but it could be a collaborative work evaluations and things like that that involve people in their homes and in their places. And there's some personal information involved there. And we're delving into the surveillance side of things as well. Is surveillance effective? Surveillance is effective, and it is a tool, but it very clearly with privacy, it has its place. So where are the lines now, and are those lines being honored? The scale of the security risk, the scale of the digital transactions is huge. And with the scale, with more digital transactions, not just because of what we're doing, but the number of transactions that we're doing digitally, there comes an increased privacy risk and increased risk of breach. So it just highlights some of the problems that were before and makes those more urgent. And these things are going to be happening more frequently. The whole question of user control and consent. Does consent work in a digital environment? And I'll get, is consent really the answer to all this? And I have an opinion about that, and I'll get into that on the regulatory side of things. There's a reliance now, we're reliant very much on our digital platforms and our systems, and these are quite dominated by some mega platforms. Now, because they are Google, Microsoft being the prime example, there is going to one place, how much is being harvested for their purposes. We are not simply playing in our own sandbox. We're playing in Google and Microsoft's sandbox. Are they accountable enough? Do we know what's going on? What are they doing with the personal information that they have access to and can harvest? And then the adoption of digital record keeping. And those are the questions around how is digital information captured, controlled to meet privacy and security requirements. So digital records management, digital record keeping, digital information management is all becoming much more, because of these challenges and all the things that are happening, are becoming much more urgent. The whole issue of how do I do that effectively with digital information. So the regulatory environment that we're dealing with, as I said, we're talking about geographical jurisdictions. really dealing with multinational networks? How do the regulators who are appointed by in this country by provinces, as well as by by the federal on the federal level, how do they collaborate? How do they work together? Because this is the reality that they're dealing with, and how do they work across borders? Is it effective? I would have to say that there is a tremendous amount of collaboration, and because there has to be among commissioners. Now, our legislation also is by and large provincial, even on a private sector level. On a federal level to a certain extent, but not very extensive. So the legislative, alignment of legislation is a problem and still is a problem. It is not a huge problem, and the commissioners are working around that. Now, I know that commissioners the commissioners' offices are swamped. They are overworked. I know that personally. And so how effective can you be if you are resource poor? Not a huge amount of incentive for governments to have a completely effective working regulator, especially if they are perhaps one of the most important objects of their regulation, the governments themselves. They put them into place really to gain public trust. But, you know, on a nickel and dime basis, we don't want to make them too effective, right? So there is always that they're fighting against. I'm not saying it's happening. It has happened in some jurisdictions, such as Newfoundland and Labrador. But that is where the regulators are coming from. So they have a limited role. They have their limited ability. Is their self-monitoring really the answer? And part of that comes from the legislation, and a lot of the private sector legislation is consent oriented. That is the ultimate authority, which is really a form of self-regulation. The individual has to know what you're doing, and then they consent. Is that consent regime working as a regulatory framework in a vastly expanding digital environment? I think it's a problem, and I've always thought it's a problem, and I don't think it's very effective. Consent can be very much manipulated. That's well known in many environments, and it is being manipulated. Really, when it comes down to it, there's every incentive to present a consent in a way that it's going to achieve the right result, and that for the organization is that they say yes. What does it mean to say no? Well, it means you don't get the service. Now, and I would say, in my estimation, that a good amount, majority of consent deals that are presented before us, let's say to download an app and allow an app to have access to a certain amount of information, there isn't an understanding of, number one, what you're consenting to. Number two, there's no realistic alternative to that. So I do want to have the app, but I don't want to do this, and then I can't have the app, which isn't always working. I think that is, consent is faulty. Consent isn't working very, very well. And beside the fact that we're not even dealing with consent, more or less, with governments and with health authorities, health providers who don't need consent according to their legislation. They must do things according to the rules of the legislation. So we're going to have to go from reactive monitoring, which is, somebody complains, then we do something, to some more active monitoring. These are privacy impact assessments, where we're becoming very, very prominent all across the country, certainly in a government setting, but perhaps also we're seeing them also in the private sector. User monitoring is being put in place, especially in the health sector, of course, for their open systems. How effective is this? I think it remains to be seen. I've been involved in some pretty large breaches in the health sector. I've been involved in analyzing them, and so these user monitoring systems only have a certain amount of value and usefulness. capturing information in a governance tracking system. So that is harder to put into place. Number one, what is the tracking system? How does that work? How can we capture information into that system? I think we're seeing inklings of it, and I want to get into that a little bit more. What we're of course talking about is information governance, and I'm not going to get into this is something that you all have heard many times before. I will say that across large international institutions, and from public sector to private sector, it has been identified as one of the big challenges of the information universe, the digital universe going forward. Here's just some quotes. The central challenge facing governing institutions, certainly on the governance side of things. And then talking about business models that are seemingly free. We need to challenge them and ensure elements are designed around fundamental human values such as privacy. So even the private sector are recognizing those values, and that is good for business to do that. United Nations quote for especially specifically relating to the pandemic, critical importance of sharing health information globally. If we're going to do that, we need digital governance, and that can't be postponed. Now, going to get into some ideas on information governance and the direction that we're looking at, throwing this out for discussion and for any ideas going forward. I've always started with, what are we talking about? If we're talking about information, do we need a definition of it? But we have a pretty good idea of what we're talking about here. I've always, and I've trained as an archivist, and full disclosure, I have trained as an archivist, comes out of that archival definition of a record, but the records management has always used the same kind of definition. My definition, information captured and used as part of or in support of a function and purpose. Information doesn't stand on its own, and our analysis of information, or governance of information, or regulation of information is related to why is this thing here? Why is this information here? What were we trying to do with it? A lot of the legislation is focused around purpose, and the allowances for collection use and disclosure are around purpose and function. What are you doing with it? Why? If that's good, but that's not good. So information gets its value and meaning from the functions and purposes which it created and used. So there's the basic principle that we're talking about. What it's about is a factor of those functions. And even data and facts don't completely stand on their own. I don't think I'm making anything up for you. That's something you determined. And information content doesn't always or completely document this functional context. So these kinds of ideas, this kind of realization, and my emphasis is on, yes, there's the content of the information, but how do we fit it up effectively with the purposes and the functions that we need? And this works with privacy, because we need to be accountable for the function and purpose that we're putting this information to use, especially personal information. So the final information governance definition: connect the disparate spheres of information into common values using sharing common tools and measures. So what I'm talking about is records management, security, privacy, maybe digital continuity, digital integrity, all of those key program goals for an organization. These are things we want to do. Information retrieval, reuse, that kind of thing. That is a common focus of information governance, and you can expand that for as much as you like. The key is it all focuses on purpose. What was the purpose? What was the function that created and used it? Therefore, a definition of information governance, a program within an organization that impartially and equitably facilitates, directs, monitors, and accounts for, that's the governing side of it, and it's directed. So we're not just allowing things to a thousand flowers bloom. It's in a way we do, and we have to. So I'll get into that to a certain extent. So the direction and the monitoring has to be done in a very special way with information, but it is a governance, directing, monitoring, accounting for, facilitating creation, use, disclosure, storage, integrity, and security of information. That's the one of the scales of the information governance regime, used to support functions and purposes. So, which functions and purposes are aligned with organizational, professional, societal goals and values? So, yes, you can have evil functions, you can have good functions. So, how do we judge which ones are which? That is something that is a larger societal, organizational, professional goal. But if we're accountable for it, right now, there's not a lot of accountability about what those goals are, number one, and number two, what are those functions fit in with those goals? So now I'm getting into the accountability. This is an accountability for what? For which purposes this is supporting. So we have to see privacy not as a barrier anymore, but as a foundation to what we do. And this is, if we see privacy that way, that will be the focus, the incentive for information governance to come in play. Companies and governments have learned the hard way that eroding, minimizing, and ignoring privacy in the way they do business has severe consequences for their brand and for the amount of participation in their services. They're talking about governments. Many companies, communication companies like Apple, have used privacy, their support for privacy and their privacy features of their products as a core part of their brand and their marketing. And that's going to become more and more. The question is this legitimate? Is this open to manipulation on their part? Is this itself saying it's easy for someone to, because we're talking about privacy as a condition of trust. With trust, you will get people participating in your service. With trust, you will get people buying your products, right? Privacy is a big factor in that. Can this be manipulated to increase trust? Trust is a perception. So it's easy to say, but harder to deliver. So it has to be something that has accountability and information around it, about information and facts. If there's lack of information and facts about what these organizations are doing with your personal information, then that should be something that will erode that trust. It should be. So full and effective accountability is key to that, and probably coming from the outside, even if the companies are saying they're doing it. Privacy by design, you may have heard of this, of course, again and again, and it comes up again and again. Those 7 principles are basically saying, look, privacy should be part of the way we do business, and as a effective way to do business. This is something that the companies want to do. Privacy is a goal of these companies, and we can build it into the systems to do that. All of those principles are saying that it's not a zero-sum game. It's integrated. It's all part of what we do. Essentially, that's what privacy by design is. So all of these things are moving towards privacy as a foundation rather than as a barrier, which is, it may have been seen as in the past. So what I'm talking about is, ironically, the idea of capturing information into an information governance regime. I'm using the term surveillance, information surveillance. How do we, and ironically, privacy and good privacy governance requires surveillance of systems. Information capture systems, I think, are the key. So how are we capturing information into a information governance regime? And it could be a records management regime for retention, but it could be information management regime for privacy. Are we collecting, using, disclosing personal information in the right way? Or for security, what is the highest risk, and applying a risk to those pieces of information on the ground? What I am sure about is that these kinds of information capture systems, if we want people to participate in them, making sure that information is scheduled, the old records management idea of scheduling information. Number one, it's got to be flexible, adaptable, local workflows. So somehow people are going to be doing are going to be doing these things locally, are going to be capturing them locally, user by user. So it has to fit in with the real world right now. Will this evolve into something that's a little more consistent? Maybe, but certainly right now we know because of the formats of information being used out there, email being the nightmare that it is, it has to be flexible and adaptable to that. How do you come up with that kind of a system and still capture information? It's got to be integrated and seamless capture system as possible, automated through the metadata, invisibly, those kinds of things. So those are the big. These are the two biggest challenges that we have to implement digital capture systems. It has to be demonstrated as a business service. It's not only going to ensure that we're compliant. It's not just compliance. It's an incentive for you to use the system to support what you do. Again, focus on purpose and function. That's going to be seem a lot more realistic. So more effective retrieval, use, and reuse. And how do we do this? We do it again through function. Now, how do we apply function and policy to information? I'm not going to get into design issues, but basically my contention is that you can only adapt information policy, how we want people to use information, what do they want to create, how it's being done, through function and purpose as a filter, and then applying it directly to the information. So all those things are three separate entities that need to be combined seamlessly in this information capture system. So that ends my presentation. I hope I haven't got too far over. Would love to talk to you, and I will be talking to you right now. This is now a recording, and I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope we have a great discussion.